The morning Evelyn Hartwell stepped off the train at Blackwater Crossing, the station master looked at her four children and laughed. Not the polite kind, the kind that came from somewhere mean. 4? He said it like a number that explained everything wrong with a person. Lord Almighty, woman, you planning on starting a circus? The people waiting on the platform didn't look away. They stared the way people stare when they're glad the trouble belongs to someone else. A man in a wool coat leaned toward his wife and said something behind his hand. She covered her mouth. Her shoulders shook. Evelyn did not move. She stood in the cold with her worn leather bag hanging from one hand, and her youngest daughter Rose pressed against her leg, and she waited until the laughter finished. Then she picked up her bag and walked forward anyway. If you have ever been the person everyone counted and found too expensive, if you have ever watched a room decide your worth before you opened your mouth, then you already know what Evelyn Hartwell carried into that station. And it wasn't luggage. Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to something real in you, I hope you'll subscribe to our channel and stay with us until the very end. Stories like this one, about the people the world writes off before it knows what they're worth. These are the stories we tell here. Hit that like button. And drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform, because the worst moment hasn't happened yet. The train had been running 4 hours behind schedule, which meant Evelyn and the children arrived after dark, in the sharp bite of early November cold, when Blackwater Crossing was already locked up and dim. Most of the lamps in the station had burned down to weak orange flickers. The ticket booth was shuttered. A dog was sleeping on the bench nearest the door. Evelyn had $4.17 in her coat pocket. She knew the exact amount because she had counted it twice on the train, holding the coins under her palm so none of the children could see and start calculating what it meant. Nathan, her oldest at 13, had already started calculating. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he kept scanning the platform like he was doing arithmetic on everything that wasn't there. A father. A wagon. A welcoming face. Someone who had come to meet them. Nobody had come to meet them. That had been a possibility Evelyn had prepared herself for. She had written 2 letters to the agency in Denver, the one that had arranged her correspondence with a ranch owner named Caleb Mercer. The first letter confirmed she was coming. The second letter said when. She had received one reply, terse and formal, saying the arrangements had been noted. She told herself that was enough. Standing on the platform in the dark with 4 tired children, she was no longer sure. Molly, who was 11, took Rose's hand without being asked. That small act, the practiced ease of it, the way Molly didn't even look down when she did it, just reached out and held, made something tighten in Evelyn's chest. Her children had learned to take care of each other. That was not a thing a mother was supposed to feel proud of. It was a thing a mother was supposed to grieve, quietly, at night, when nobody could see. Ethan, her middle boy at 9, was trying not to shiver. She could see him working at it, jaw locked, arms pulled tight against his sides, small body held rigid against the cold. He had decided somewhere around age 7 that showing weakness was the same as causing a problem. Evelyn didn't know where he'd learned that. She suspected she knew. "Mama," Rose tugged her coat. "Is the man here?" "He'll come," Evelyn said. Rose looked at the empty platform. "How do you know?" Evelyn crouched down so they were eye level. Rose had their father's eyes, dark, slightly too serious for a 6-year-old. "Because I wrote him 2 letters," she said, "and he wrote back." "That's not how knowing works," Nathan said flatly from behind her. She stood up and looked at her oldest son. He was taller than she expected him to be, had grown nearly 2 inches since summer, so his coat sleeves were short and his wrists showed in the cold. He was looking at the dark road that led away from the station, already plotting, already building the exit route in his head. "Nathan." "I'm just saying. I know what you're saying," she kept her voice even. "Give it 1 hour." He said nothing, which, with Nathan, meant he was deciding whether to agree or whether to start walking. The station master, a squat man with a reddish face and a uniform that had gotten too small for him somewhere over the last decade, emerged from the ticket booth with a broom he didn't appear to be using for sweeping. He was using it as a reason to linger near them. Evelyn recognized that posture. The official purpose that was actually just curiosity dressed up in something it could hold. "You waiting on someone?" he said, looking at the children while he spoke to her. Caleb Mercer, Evelyn said. He owns a ranch about 6 miles out. The station master made a sound that wasn't a word. It had an opinion in it. You know him? Evelyn asked. Everybody knows Mercer. He kept looking at the children. 1, 2. His eyes moved. 3, 4. She watched him count. She had watched men count her children 100 times, and she had learned to read the exact moment it happened. The small flicker in the expression, the recalibration, the arithmetic that always came out the same way. He's expecting all of you? The question was its own answer. He already knew. He was saying it out loud so she would hear it. He is, Evelyn said. The station master resumed his fake sweeping. Well, station closes at 9. You'll want to have arrangements by then. He went back inside. Nathan said, We should start walking. We're not walking 6 miles in the dark, Evelyn said. Better than freezing on this platform. Nathan, 1 hour. He turned away from her. She watched the back of his neck, the way it stayed rigid, held high, trying to look older than it was. 13 and already exhausted by the world. Already certain the world was going to confirm every bad thing he believed about it. She wished she could tell him he was wrong. She wasn't sure he was. The man who came was not what she expected. She had built a picture of Caleb Mercer from his letters, which were short and had very little color in them. He had written that he needed someone capable of managing a household and assisting with ranch accounts. He had written that the work was substantial and the conditions were not easy. He had written nothing about himself except what he could provide: shelter, a wage, the arrangement of a proper household. She had pictured someone older, stiff, a man who ran his life the way he ran his accounts, in straight, airless columns. The man who came through the station door at 8:20 was somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a coat that had seen several bad winters and not enough repairs. He was not especially tall. He had the kind of face that had spent years outdoors, not weathered in a romantic way, weathered in the way that meant genuine exposure to genuine cold. There was a scar along his left jaw she would later learn came from a fence wire accident when he was 19. He was not handsome in any movie poster sense of the word. He was something more specific than that. He looked like a man who was still surprised sometimes that he was still standing. He saw her immediately. She was not hard to see. A woman in a brown coat with 4 children arranged around her like a small, watchful constellation. He stopped about 10 feet away and took off his hat. Mrs. Hartwell? Yes. He looked at the children, and here it was. Here was the moment she had learned to recognize, the moment the arithmetic happened, the moment she found out what kind of person she was dealing with. He looked at them for a long moment, long enough that Nathan shifted his weight beside her, long enough that Evelyn felt the familiar bracing, the lockdown that happened in her chest when she prepared to hear a man tell her something had changed. Then Caleb Mercer said, "Which one's the oldest?" Nathan blinked. "I am." "You good with horses?" A pause. "I don't know. I've never been around many." Caleb nodded like this was useful information. "We'll find out then." He looked at Evelyn. "I'm sorry I'm late. The road's frozen on the north side of the ridge and the wagon threw a wheel. I had to leave it and ride back for another." That was it. That was his explanation. Not a word about the children. Not a single recalculation. Evelyn realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly, quietly, so he wouldn't hear. The wagon ride to the ranch took an hour and 20 minutes in the dark, with a wind coming off the plains that had no interest in the comfort of the people it was passing through. Evelyn sat up front beside Caleb. The children were bundled in the wagon bed under a canvas tarp he'd brought, which Molly organized with the efficient authority of a girl who had done harder things than keep her siblings warm. They didn't talk much, she and Caleb. He asked her once if she was warm enough. She said yes, which was partially true. He told her the road was rough for the next mile and to hold on. She held on. At one point, Rose cried out from beneath the canvas. A small, startled sound, not real distress, just the cry of a child jolted by an unexpected bump, and Caleb pulled the horse to a stop. "Everyone all right back there?" "Fine." Molly's voice, firm and slightly annoyed at Rose. "We're fine." He waited another second before he clicked the horse forward. Evelyn noticed. She filed it away. The ranch house appeared out of the darkness as a shape first, wide, low, more rooms than she had expected. A light burned in one window. He must have left a lamp on before he came for them, she realized, so they wouldn't arrive to complete darkness. She didn't say anything about that either. He helped her down from the wagon with one hand, not making a production of it, just offering it because the step was icy and it was a practical thing to do. The children climbed down behind her. Rose grabbed Molly's hand again. Ethan stood straight and tried to look like someone who was not desperately cold. Nathan stood slightly apart, hands in his pockets, looking at the ranch house with an expression Evelyn recognized. He was measuring it, checking the exits, building the picture of what this place was so he would know how to leave it if he had to. Caleb led them to the front door and pushed it open. The warmth that came out was not the polite warmth of a heated room. It was wood fire warmth, the deep, real kind that has been burning long enough to soak into the walls and the floorboards. Evelyn felt it hit her face, and her eyes stung, not from the heat but from something else she was not going to acknowledge in front of her children or this man she had just met. She blinked it away. "Kitchen's through there," Caleb said, gesturing. "There's soup on the stove. It's not elegant." He paused. "There are rooms enough. I'll show you in the morning when there's light. Tonight, just get warm." Rose had already walked past him toward the fire in the main room. She stood in front of it with her palms out, her whole small body leaning toward the heat like a flower toward sun. Caleb watched her. Something happened in his face that Evelyn almost missed because she was watching Rose too. A softening. No, not softening. Something more complicated than that. A door opening in a room that had been locked for a long time, just a crack, just enough to let in a thin line of light. He turned away before she could see more. "Soup," he said again, and walked toward the kitchen. They ate at a long wooden table in the dining room. 6 chairs around it, though only 5 of them sat. Caleb pulled one chair slightly away from the table and draped his coat over it, and said nothing about the empty chair, and Evelyn said nothing about it either, but she counted them. 6 chairs. 5 people at the table. 1 chair empty. She would think about that chair later. The soup was bean and salt pork, and it was not elegant, as he had said, but it was hot, and there was enough of it, and nobody complained. Rose fell asleep sitting upright between 2 spoonfuls. Ethan ate everything in his bowl and then looked at the pot on the sideboard with an expression of tremendous restraint. Caleb noticed, stood up without comment, brought the pot over and ladled more into Ethan's bowl. Ethan said, "Thank you," in a voice tight with the effort of not seeming hungry. "Growing boys need more than a widow's portion," Caleb said. Matter of fact. Not kind, just accurate. Ethan ate the second bowl. Nathan ate in silence, which was his version of being polite. He had not relaxed since they'd arrived. His eyes moved around the room the way they always moved, cataloging, measuring, checking. Evelyn watched him watching the house, and she knew what he was doing. He was deciding whether to trust it. She was doing the same thing. After supper, Caleb carried Rose to the room he'd set aside for the children without asking permission or making an announcement. He just picked her up from where she'd slumped in her chair, settled her against his shoulder, and walked down the hall. Evelyn followed. He laid Rose on a bed that had a quilt on it, a real quilt, not a blanket, a quilt that someone had made, and he stepped back and let Evelyn tuck her in. He left without saying anything. Evelyn stood there for a moment after the door closed. She looked at Rose's sleeping face, at the quilt, at the room with the real furniture and the one small window with a dark curtain pulled across it against the cold. She thought about the station platform, the station master's sweep of the broom, the count. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the sound of it. The particular sound of a man deciding you were too much. She thought about Caleb Mercer's face in the station, looking at her children, and not counting. Later that night, when all 4 children were asleep and the house had gone quiet, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee she'd been carrying around for half an hour, and she tried to make a ledger of the evening, the way she made ledgers of everything now. Because you had to know what you were working with, what was real, what was hope dressed up as fact. Caleb Mercer had not said a single word about the 4 children. He had asked Nathan if he was good with horses. He had given Ethan more soup without ceremony. He had carried Rose to bed. He had put 6 chairs around a table that had, until tonight, held one. She told herself not to read into it. She had read into things before. She had believed in men before who turned out to be something different in the daylight. She was not going to make that mistake again. She picked up her cold coffee and took a sip and made herself stop feeling things for the night. Tomorrow she would see what this place looked like in the light. She would meet it honestly. She would figure out what was real. And she would keep counting because she had learned a long time ago that a woman alone with 4 children could not afford to be surprised by arithmetic. Outside, the wind came off the plains and found the cracks in the walls and pushed through, cold and insistent. Inside, a fire was still burning. And for the first time in a longer time than Evelyn could clearly remember, nobody was asking her to leave. She had promised herself she would meet this place honestly in the morning light. The morning light was not kind. It never was, on the frontier. The sun came up flat and hard over the plains, without the softness of trees or hills to break it, and it showed everything exactly as it was. The cracked mud between the porch boards, the sagging hinge on the barn door, the long brown grass that pressed flat against the earth under the weight of last night's frost. The ranch house itself was solid enough, built by someone who understood cold and permanence. But solid was not the same as cared for, and it was clear to Evelyn, standing on the porch with her second cup of morning coffee going cold in her hands, that this property had been maintained rather than loved for a long time. There was a difference between those two things. She knew it well. The kitchen had flour, salt, cornmeal, a good side of cured pork hanging from a hook in the cold pantry, and 3 jars of preserved beans she suspected had been put up the previous summer. There was enough to work with, enough to feed 5 people for a reasonable stretch if she was careful. She was always careful. Rose found her on the porch at 7, still in her nightgown, hair tangled from sleep, dragging a quilt behind her like a small empress. "It's cold," Rose announced. "It's November," Evelyn said. "Where's the man?" "His name is Mr. Mercer, and I don't know." Rose climbed onto the porch chair without asking and wrapped the quilt around herself until only her face showed. She looked out at the ranch yard, the barn, the corral fence, the long, flat stretch of frozen land beyond. A horse was visible in the corral, dark brown, moving in slow circles. "Is that his horse?" "I expect so." "It's big." "Horses usually are." Rose considered this with the gravity of someone making a formal assessment. Then she said, "I like it here." Evelyn looked at her youngest daughter. Rose said things like this, just set them down plain, without checking first whether they were safe to say. She had not yet learned to be careful with her own feelings. Evelyn didn't know if that was something she should be glad about or something she should quietly worry about fixing. "We just got here," Evelyn said. "I know," Rose said. "I still like it." Caleb appeared from the barn at 7:15. He walked with the particular stride of someone who had been up for hours already. No hesitation in it, no waking up still happening. He saw Evelyn on the porch and gave a short nod that meant good morning and kept walking toward the house. "Coffee's on the stove," Evelyn said as he came up the steps. He stopped. Something brief moved through his expression. "You didn't need to do that." "I was making it for myself," she said, which was true. He looked at her for a moment like he was trying to determine if she meant it as a kindness or a deflection. Then he went inside. Rose watched him go. "He doesn't talk much," she said. "No," Evelyn agreed. "Papa didn't talk much in the morning either." Evelyn took a sip of her cold coffee and said nothing. Rose pulled the quilt tighter and watched the horse in the corral. Inside, she could hear the sound of a cup being set on the stove. The particular sound of a person being careful not to make too much noise in a house that wasn't entirely his anymore, even though it was entirely his. She had noticed that last night too. The way Caleb moved through his own home with a certain tentativeness, like a man double-checking his right to be in a room. She had lived with a man for 9 years. She knew what that particular carefulness meant. It meant he was used to being alone. It meant the presence of other people was still slightly foreign to him, something he had to remind himself was allowed. She didn't know yet whether that was going to be a problem or just a fact. By mid-morning, all 4 children were up, and Nathan had already found the barn. This was not surprising. Nathan had a habit of locating the most useful place in any new situation and attaching himself to it. On the train, he'd spent an hour in the cargo compartment helping a man secure a loose crate, not because he was asked, not because he expected payment, but because he needed to be doing something that mattered. It was the thing Evelyn loved most about her oldest son. It was also the thing that kept her up at night, because a 13-year-old boy who needed to be useful was a boy who had learned too early that his presence needed to be justified. Caleb found Nathan in the barn attempting to figure out the rigging on a work harness that had gotten its straps tangled. He stood in the doorway and watched for a moment before he spoke. "You've got it upside down," he said. Nathan turned. "I can see that. I'm trying to figure out how it goes right side up." "Here." Caleb came in and took one end of the harness, not reaching for it without asking, just picking up the other end so they were both holding it. "This loop goes over the collar first, then the breeching comes through here." Nathan watched. He didn't say thank you. He paid attention, which was his version of it. They worked it out together in silence, Caleb showing rather than explaining, Nathan following the logic of each step with his hands. When it was done and hung correctly on its hook, Caleb stepped back and looked at the boy properly for the first time. "How old are you?" 13. "You know how to drive a team?" "No." "You know how to brush a horse?" "No." "What do you know?" Nathan met his eyes without flinching. "Numbers. I'm good at numbers. I know how to stretch a week of food to 10 days. I know how to spot when someone's trying to cheat you on a price." A pause. "I know how to take care of people." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Those aren't small things," he said finally. "No," Nathan said. "They're not." Caleb looked at him a moment longer. Then he took down a brush from the shelf and held it out. "We'll start with the horse," he said. "The rest we can build from there." Nathan took the brush. He did not look like a boy who was warming to someone. He looked like a boy who was reserving judgment. But he took the brush, and he followed Caleb to the horse, and that was the closest thing to an opening that Nathan Hartwell had offered anyone outside his own family in 3 years. Evelyn spent the morning understanding the house. This was how she had always approached a new situation. Not by asking questions, but by walking through it with her hands. She opened every cabinet and drawer. She checked what the stove needed and how it ran. She found the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor and went down the wooden ladder with a lamp and cataloged everything on the shelves. She found a leak in the roof of the back room, a small one, marked by a brown stain on the ceiling plaster in a bucket. She didn't have to wonder about because it was positioned directly beneath it, already there, already part of the house's long accommodation of its own damage. She found a room she hadn't been shown. It was off the main hallway, the door half open. She pushed it and looked in. It was not a bedroom. It had been one, once. There was the shape of a bed frame still visible in the worn floor, the marks of 4 posts pressed into the wood over years of weight. But the frame was gone. The room held 3 chairs pushed against one wall, a dresser with an empty top, and a window that looked out toward the east field. Nothing else. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty room and did not go inside. Some rooms told you their history before you were ready to hear it. This one was doing that. She pulled the door back to where she found it and kept walking. The first real friction came at noon. Evelyn had made lunch, cornbread and a bean soup, working with what was available, and she'd called everyone to the table. Molly helped set it. Ethan came immediately, which was his nature. Rose appeared with the quilt still trailing, which was hers. Nathan came in from the barn smelling of horse and winter air and sat down without washing his hands. "Nathan," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Wash your hands." "They're not dirty." "They're covered in stable," she said. "Wash them." He pushed back from the table with a scrape of the chair that was not quite defiant but was close to it, went to the wash basin by the kitchen door, ran his hands under water for approximately 4 seconds, and came back. Caleb had watched all of this without comment. He was sitting at the head of the table. The place he sat, she had already established that, without discussing it, it was simply where he was. And he had the slightly careful expression of a man trying to determine whether he was permitted to have an opinion on something. "It's enough," Evelyn said to Nathan. "Not angry, just done with it." Nathan sat. Caleb said nothing and reached for the cornbread. Ethan said, "I washed mine." "I know," Evelyn said. "Before you had to ask." Ethan, "I'm just noting it." Molly said to no one in particular, "Can we please eat?" Rose was already eating, having never stopped to participate in any part of this conversation. Caleb looked at his bowl, and Evelyn caught something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the near miss of one. The expression that comes before the decision not to smile in front of people you don't know well enough yet. She looked down at her own bowl. That near miss of a smile. She filed it away with the 6 chairs and the lamp left burning and the bucket under the leak. She was keeping a running list without meaning to. A record of small things that were not small at all. What? The afternoon brought the first problem. Evelyn had gone to look at the household accounts. Caleb had gestured at a lockbox on the desk in the front room and said she was welcome to understand where things stood. She understood very quickly. The ranch was not failing, but it was not comfortable either. There were 2 outstanding payments on equipment that had been pushed back season to season and had collected enough in accumulated fees that they were now meaningfully larger than their original amounts. The supply account at the general store in Blackwater Crossing had a balance that suggested either a very hard last year or a man who had stopped paying close attention. Both, she suspected. She was looking at the papers when Caleb came in from the back field. He saw the lockbox open on the desk and stopped. "I can close it," she said immediately. "If you'd rather No." He came into the room and took the chair across from her, looked at the papers. Something settled in his expression that was not quite defeat but was related to it. "I know what's in there. The equipment payments." "Yes." "And the store account." "Yes." She waited. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, the gesture of a man who was not used to having this conversation. It was a rough winter last year," he said. "I lost 6 head of cattle in a blizzard in January. Broke a piece of equipment I couldn't afford to replace immediately, but needed to replace immediately. Made some decisions under pressure that I would have made differently if I hadn't been—" He stopped. "Alone," she said. He looked at her. "Yes." She looked back at the papers. "The equipment debt can be restructured if you talk to the lender before the end of the season. The store account I can manage if you give me 4 months. She set the paper down. "Neither of these is fatal." "I know that," he said, a slight edge in it. The edge of a man who didn't appreciate being told his problems were manageable, even if it was true. "I'm not suggesting you didn't know," she said, the same even tone. "I'm just telling you what I can do about it." A pause. He looked at the papers. "You've handled accounts before?" "My husband worked for the railroad. He handled money the way water handles fire." She kept her voice flat. "So I handled the accounts." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll talk to the lender." "Good," she said. "And I'll need to know what the store carries and what it doesn't, because there are things I can source from the farm that will reduce what we're spending there. I can show you on Saturday. I go into town on Saturday." "That works." He stood. He had one hand on the back of the chair and he was looking at the floor for a moment, not at her. Then he said, "Thank you for looking at it honestly." She almost said something. She wasn't sure what. Instead, she said, "That's what I'm here for." It was the right answer. It was also, she admitted to herself after he left the room, not the only answer she'd had. The children moved through the first week the way children always do, finding their edges. Ethan discovered that Caleb kept a set of woodworking tools in the shed off the barn and asked, with slightly more directness than politeness, if he could see them. Caleb showed him. By the 3rd day, Ethan was spending an hour each afternoon in the shed with Caleb's permission and a piece of scrap wood, trying to make something he couldn't yet articulate. Shavings accumulated on the floor. He swept them himself without being asked. Molly found the corner of the front room with the best light and started drawing there. She had a stub of pencil and used whatever paper she could find. The backs of ledger pages Evelyn marked as obsolete, smooth-sided flour sacks cut flat. The inside cover of a catalog that had arrived addressed to someone Caleb didn't mention. Her drawings were not the drawings of a child trying to make something pretty. They were the drawings of someone trying to understand a thing by putting it on paper. She drew the horse, the barn, the corral fence. She drew Caleb's hands, just his hands, setting a tool down, without telling anyone that's what she was drawing. Rose found the dog. She found him on the 2nd day, living under the porch, a medium-sized brown dog of no clear heritage, who had apparently arrived at the ranch during the previous summer and decided to stay without being formally invited. Caleb called him Ticket, for reasons he did not explain. Rose called him Ticket also, and within 48 hours the dog had reorganized his entire existence around the small girl who smelled like cornbread and talked to him constantly about things he received with great and apparent seriousness. Caleb noticed. He said nothing. He brought an extra bowl to the porch and put water in it and left it there, and Rose never mentioned it, and neither did he. Nathan watched all of this. He was thawing, but slowly, and with great suspicion of his own thawing. Evelyn could see it, the way he'd sometimes pause in the middle of being comfortable and catch himself and pull back. Like a person testing ice by taking one step and then retreating before they put their full weight down. She recognized it because she was doing it herself. The house had a rhythm she was learning. Caleb was up before first light every morning, without exception. He ate whatever she made without comment, not without appreciation. She learned to read his appreciation in the way he finished everything on his plate and the way he refilled his coffee without asking if he could, which meant he felt at home enough to reach for things, which was its own kind of response. He worked the ranch from before light to after dark. He came in for meals. In the evenings, he sat at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger or a catalog, or occasionally a newspaper that was 3 weeks old by the time it reached Blackwater Crossing, and he read in silence while Evelyn did the mending or went over her own accounts, and the children occupied the other end of the house at whatever they occupied it with. It was domestic. It was improbable. It was completely without the pretense of ease. They were two adults in a house trying to share a space they had not been raised to share with someone they did not know, and every day they were finding the edges of what that meant. The trouble in town started on the second Saturday. Caleb had taken Evelyn and the younger children into Blackwater Crossing for the supply run. Nathan stayed behind with the older horse and the task of mucking out the barn, which he had agreed to with the air of someone making a sacrifice of great magnitude. The general store was run by a woman named Dora Phelps, who was somewhere in her late 50s, and had the particular energy of a person who processed information fastest when she could file it into recognizable categories. Evelyn recognized that energy immediately because she had spent years being the thing people couldn't file. Dora Phelps was polite. She was professionally polite, which is to say the warmth in it was exactly as warm as the situation required and not 1 degree more. She helped Evelyn find what she needed. She added the items to Caleb's account with efficiency. She asked after Caleb in the way people ask, after someone they've known a long time and have watched go through hard things, carefully, without landing on anything specific. But the other woman in the store, Evelyn never caught her name, a tall woman in a gray coat who was examining fabric bolts near the window, was not being polite. She was being quiet in the specific way that has a conversation in it. Evelyn heard her say something low to the woman beside her. She didn't catch all of it. She caught enough. 4 of them. Not sure what Mercer was thinking. Not exactly a light burden to take on. Evelyn kept her back straight and kept looking at the shelf in front of her. Rose was holding her hand. Evelyn squeezed it once, gently, and felt Rose squeeze back with the automatic trust of a child who doesn't yet know what's being said about her but knows her mother's hand. Caleb was at the counter. He was talking to Dora about the equipment account. He may or may not have heard. Evelyn didn't look at him to check. The woman in the gray coat said something else. The word she clearly heard this time was responsibility, and the silence after it. Evelyn set the tin of salt back on the shelf and turned around and looked at the woman in the gray coat with the level, unafraid gaze of someone who has been the object of that kind of quiet for too long to be intimidated by it anymore. The woman in the gray coat met her eyes, looked away first, turned back to the fabric bolts. Evelyn picked up the salt again and put it in the basket. She didn't feel victorious. She felt the particular exhaustion of a woman who has had to win the same small fight in 100 different rooms. And the tiredness isn't about the fight. It's about the fact that the fight keeps existing. On the wagon home, Caleb drove and said nothing for a long time. The children were in the back. Rose had fallen asleep against Molly. Ethan was watching the horizon with the studious attention of someone who has chosen not to know about a thing he heard. Finally, Caleb said, "People in this town talk." "I know," Evelyn said. "They don't always know what they're talking about." "I know that too." He was quiet for another mile. Then, "I'm not going to tell you it gets better fast. It probably gets better slow, if it gets better." She looked at the road ahead. "I've dealt with slow before." He nodded, once. No more than that. It was not a comfort exactly. It was something more durable than comfort. It was honesty about a hard thing, offered plainly, without decoration. She had learned to value that more than she'd once expected to. The moment that shifted something, not everything, just something, one piece of a larger structure that was still being built, happened on a Tuesday, the 3rd week. It was a small thing and a large thing at the same time. Caleb had come in from the north field at noon, and Evelyn had seen from the kitchen window that he was favoring his right arm. He sat down at the table and reached for the water pitcher, and she watched him try to hide the way the reach cost him. "What happened?" she said. "Fence post." She came around the table and looked at his arm without asking permission. The skin below the elbow was scraped raw in a long diagonal line, not deep enough to be serious, but it needed cleaning, and she could see by the way it was already starting to swell underneath that there might be more going on. "Sit still," she said. "It's fine." "It isn't. Sit still." He sat still. She cleaned it. He didn't make a sound, which told her it hurt more than it looked. She bound it with a strip of clean cloth from the rag drawer. He watched his own arm with the focused, slightly resentful expression of a person who finds being tended to uncomfortable. "You should have come in right away," she said. "I had 3 more fence posts." The fence posts were not going anywhere. Neither was the arm. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with something that might, on another face, have been amusement. On his face, it was subtler than that. Just a small lightness. A window opened briefly. "You're stubborn," she said. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "Stubborn is efficient." She tied off the bandage. "It's not efficient. It's a good way to have an infected arm in January." He looked at his arm. It was just a fence post. This time. She stepped back. He flexed his fingers, testing it, and the movement tugged something, and she watched the brief flicker in his expression that he would not have shown anyone who was watching for it. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded and went back to the stove. Her heart was doing something she was not ready to acknowledge. She focused on the pot, on the heat, on the practical sequence of making the next thing that needed making. Behind her, she heard the chair push back, his boots on the floor. Then, just before he went out, he stopped. "Evelyn." She turned. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his bandaged arm at his side and the thin November light coming through the window behind him. His face had the expression of someone who has been working up to something for a while and is not entirely certain this is the right moment, but has run out of better ones. "Those people in the store," he said, "what they said, or what they think. It's got nothing to do with what I think." She looked at him. "I want to be clear about that," he said. "I should have said it in the wagon. I don't know why I didn't." She held that for a moment. It was not a declaration of anything. It was not a promise. It was a man saying that he meant a thing he'd implied, which is different from meaning it, and she knew the difference. But she also knew that a man who only means things when they're easy to say is not the same as a man who says a hard thing poorly, but still says it. "I heard you," she said. He nodded once. He went back outside. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. Ethan asked about the empty room on a Thursday morning. He asked it the way he asked everything, directly, without cushioning it, without checking whether the question was permitted. "There's a room off the hall," he said to Caleb. They were in the shed. Caleb was showing him how to sharpen a chisel. "Nobody uses it." Caleb's hands kept moving. "I know." "Did something happen there?" Caleb set the chisel down. He was quiet long enough that Ethan, who was not good at silence the way Nathan was, shifted his weight. Then Caleb said, "There was someone who was going to use it." Ethan waited. "My wife," Caleb said. "We were going to—" She was— He stopped, picked up the chisel, set it back down. "She died before the room had a chance to be what it was supposed to be, that's all." Ethan looked at the shed floor. "I'm sorry," he said, in the frank, simple way of a 9-year-old who has also been close to loss and knows that the only thing to say is the plain thing. "Thank you," Caleb said, also plain. "Is that why you built a table with 6 chairs?" Ethan said. Caleb looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Not pain exactly, but the country adjacent to it. "You counted them," Caleb said. "I count things," Ethan said. "Like Mama." Caleb looked at the wall of the shed for a moment. Then he reached for the sharpening stone and said, "Yes, that's why." Ethan nodded. He picked up his own piece of wood and his practice chisel and didn't say anything else. But something in the set of his small shoulders was different. The kind of different that comes when a child understands something he didn't understand before. Not happily, but honestly, which is worth more. Evelyn heard it from Nathan, who heard it from Ethan. She filed it away with everything else. The table, the lamp, the bandaged arm, the room off the hall, the near miss of a smile at lunch. She was building something in her mind. She didn't know yet what shape it would take. She only knew that it was getting harder and harder to convince herself she wasn't building it. The night she heard him in the dining room, alone, was the night something in her chest finally stopped arguing. It was late. The children were asleep. She had gotten up for water and heard a sound from the dining room. Not talking, not movement, just the creak of a chair, and then stillness. She stood in the hallway and looked through the half-open door. Caleb was sitting at the long table. 6 chairs. He was in his chair, at the head. The lamp was low. In front of him on the table was something small. She couldn't see it clearly at first. She moved slightly and the light caught it. A rattle. The kind you give an infant. He was not holding it. It was sitting on the table in front of him, and he was looking at it, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a person who hadn't known she was there. She did not go in. She stood in the hallway and understood the 6 chairs and the empty room in the house that had been maintained rather than loved. And she understood the year of bad decisions under pressure and the table that had been built for people who never came to sit at it. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and she did not sleep for a long time. And she said nothing to herself about hope, because she had learned to be careful with hope. But she thought about a man sitting at an empty table in the dark with a rattle in front of him. And she thought about herself standing on a train platform in the cold, counting 4 children and 4 reasons to be refused. And she thought that maybe, not certainly, not safely, but maybe, 2 people with empty things were not the same as 2 people with nothing. The wind pushed against the walls outside. Inside, the house held its heat, and Evelyn Hartwell lay in the dark and breathed steadily and reminded herself to be careful, and told herself she would be careful, and believed it a little less than she had the week before. She had told herself to be careful. She had been telling herself that for 3 weeks, and it had been working, more or less. The way a bandage works on something that is still bleeding underneath. Functional, necessary, and not the same as healed. December came to Blackwater Crossing the way it always did on the plains. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, like a door kicked open. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days. The ground froze solid past the point where a fence post could be driven without a steel bar and a lot of patience, and the sky took on the particular white-gray color that old-timers read the way other people read newspapers. Caleb looked at that sky on the first Monday of December, and came in from the morning chores without his usual pace, with something quieter in him than his regular quiet. "How bad?" Evelyn said. She was at the stove. "Could be nothing," he said, hanging his coat. "Could be a serious storm before the week's out." "What do you need to do?" He looked at her. She had noticed he did that, looked at her directly when she asked him something practical, as though the practicality of the question was itself a thing he wasn't entirely accustomed to. As though he had spent long enough talking to himself that a real question from a real person required a moment to locate. "Extra wood," he said, "more than we have laid in. I need to check the north fence line before the ground gets worse, and the livestock need to be closer. There's a section of the lower barn I haven't opened in 2 winters. It'll need clearing." "Nathan can help with the wood," Evelyn said. "He's been looking for something physical to do. He's getting restless." Caleb nodded slowly. "I'll take him with me to the lower barn this morning." "And the fence line?" "That's a tomorrow problem if the sky holds." She turned back to the stove. Behind her she heard him pour coffee, heard the familiar sound of him settling at the table with the weight of a man thinking through a list. She had learned his silences the way you learn to read handwriting. The shape of each one was different once you'd seen enough of them. This one was planning. It was not the bad kind. "Evelyn." The children, Ethan and Molly especially, they should stay close to the house once the weather turns. Rose. "I don't worry about, she'll follow Ticket under the porch and be fine. But Ethan has the habit of wandering toward the shed and losing track of time." "I know," she said. "I'll tell him." A pause. "You might tell him there's a reason rather than just a rule. He listens better to reasons." She turned and looked at Caleb. He was looking at his coffee cup. He said it the same way he said most things. Matter of fact, no particular weight on it. But he had observed Ethan specifically enough to know how Ethan listened, and that was not a small thing. You're right, she said. I'll tell him there's a reason. He nodded, still looking at his cup. She turned back to the stove and let that sit where it was, because picking it up and examining it would require a kind of honesty she was still rationing carefully. Nathan did not complain about the lower barn. He would have complained about being asked to do something that felt like being kept busy, like a child given a task to manage him. But Caleb had asked him plainly, standing in the yard with his coat collar up against the wind, explaining what needed moving and why, talking to him the way you talk to someone whose labor you actually require. Nathan had listened with his jaw set and his eyes tracking the practical problem, and when Caleb finished, Nathan said, "How many trips do you think?" "Depends on what's in there," Caleb said. 3, maybe 4? "Let's look first," Nathan said, "then decide." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "All right," he said. They took 4 trips. Nathan did not mention that he'd been right about assessing before deciding. Caleb did not mention it either. They worked through it in silence and in the kind of functional coordination that develops between two people who have figured out without words how the other one moves. On the last trip, clearing a stack of old hay that had gone damp and needed to be pitched, Nathan found something under the bottom layer. A child's wooden horse, painted red, one leg broken. He picked it up and looked at it. Then he looked at Caleb. Caleb was facing away, moving a feed bag. He didn't see Nathan find it. Nathan set the wooden horse on the window ledge without saying anything. He picked up his pitchfork and kept working. Later, when they were closing the barn door and the sky was pressing lower and the first thin needles of snow were starting to come off the plains, Caleb glanced up at the window from outside and stopped. Nathan watched him see the wooden horse on the ledge. Caleb stood there a moment, then he kept walking. Nathan didn't ask. He had learned, not from anyone teaching him, but from years of being the oldest in a house where things went wrong, that some questions were less useful than the silence you kept around them. The storm arrived on Wednesday night, which was slightly sooner than the sky had suggested and slightly worse than Caleb had planned for. Evelyn woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of it. Not the sound she had expected, which was wind, but a combined sound, wind and ice, and something harder, sleet hitting the roof in long, sweeping sheets like gravel thrown from a height. The temperature in the bedroom had dropped enough that her breath showed. She was up before she was fully awake, moving down the hall to check the children, checking the stove, checking the wood box beside it. The wood box was full. Caleb had filled it before he went to bed. She hadn't watched him do it, but she had heard him. 2 trips to the porch stack, the particular sound of the wood box being loaded, and she had filed it under things she was not ready to say anything about. She added wood to the stove and sat in the kitchen in the dark and listened to the storm dismantle the night outside. Caleb came in from the hallway at 3:45, already dressed. "I need to check the livestock," he said. "In this?" She looked at the window, which was opaque with ice. "They're in the lower barn, but the door latch is old. If the wind gets under it right." "How long?" 30 minutes. "Take the rope from the porch post," she said. "Tie it to the door so you have a line back." He looked at her. "I've done this before." "I know," she said. "Take the rope anyway." A pause. He took the rope. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a coffee cup that was too hot to drink and listened to the storm for 30 minutes. She watched the window. She did not let herself think past the watching. He was back in 28 minutes. He came in with his coat solid with ice on the shoulders and his face raw from the cold, and he said, "Latch held," and she said, "Good," and that was the entire conversation, and it was enough. The storm lasted 2 full days. They were 2 days inside a house with 5 people who had only known each other for a month and now had nowhere to go. Evelyn had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, practically, without sentiment. She had made sure there was enough food. She had organized a rotation of tasks to give the children structure so the walls didn't start closing in. What she had not prepared for was Caleb at close quarters for 48 hours with nowhere to retreat to. He was not difficult. That was not the word. He was simply present in a way that the usual rhythm of the ranch, which kept him outside and working from first light, didn't allow for. He was at the kitchen table with the ledger. He was in the main room when the children were in the main room. He was in the spaces of the house that she moved through, and there was no avoiding the fact of him in a way that the ordinary day permitted. On the first afternoon, Rose climbed onto the chair beside him while he was working at the table and started telling him about Ticket, who was under the porch surviving the storm in his own fashion. Caleb listened. He did not stop working. But he listened, actually listened, following what she said and asking one question that proved it, asking whether Ticket had ever come inside, which led Rose into a detailed explanation of the one time she had tried to bring him through the kitchen door and what Evelyn had said about it. "What did your mother say?" Caleb asked. "She said the dog belongs outside because I already have 3 siblings, and that's enough animals in the house." Caleb looked up from the ledger. Rose looked at him with perfect seriousness. And this time, the near miss of a smile became the actual thing, brief, real, and entirely unguarded, the first proper smile Evelyn had seen on his face since they'd arrived. Evelyn was standing at the kitchen counter and she turned back to what she was doing before he could look up and catch her watching. Her chest was doing the thing she was still categorically refusing to name. It was on the second evening of the storm that Nathan began to come apart. Not in a visible way. Not in a way the younger children would have noticed, or Caleb, who didn't yet know all of Nathan's frequencies. But Evelyn knew. She had been reading Nathan since he was 4 years old, and she could read the signs the way she could read weather. Not the dramatic signals, but the small ones. The way he stopped participating in the table conversations. The way he found reasons to be in the room adjacent to wherever most people were, rather than the room itself. The way he was checking the front window every 20 minutes, looking out at the storm with an expression that had a calculation behind it. She found him in the hallway near the front door at 8 in the evening. "Thinking about going somewhere?" she said. He turned. "No." "Nathan." He looked at the door. "There's a man in town, at the feed store. He told me he sometimes takes on boys my age for work." He said it quickly, getting it out before he could stop himself. "Day work. Hauling. He said he could use someone reliable." Evelyn kept her voice level. "You heard this when?" "Last Saturday, when we were at the store." He looked at her. "Mama, we have 5 people eating from one ranch's income and the accounts aren't good, and I'm 13. I can work. I should be working. I shouldn't just be here taking up—" "Don't say it," Evelyn said. "I'm just saying what's true." "Nathan." She stepped toward him. "You are not a burden. You are not a line item. You are my son, and you are 13 years old, and your job right now is not to solve my problems." "Somebody has to." "I do," she said. "That is my job, not yours." He looked at her with the expression she had been fighting for 3 years, the expression that had too much adulthood in it for a face his age, the expression that came from having watched her be refused too many times and having decided, somewhere in the arithmetic of his own young mind, that the refusing was connected to him. "He's going to leave," Nathan said. Quietly, not angry, just stating it the way he would state a fact about weather or accounting. They all do. And when he does, we're going to need— "He's not leaving," Evelyn said. Nathan looked at her with something that was almost pity. "How do you know?" She opened her mouth, closed it, because she didn't know. That was the truth. She had a list of small evidence: the rope, the lamp, the 6 chairs, the soup, the bandaged arm, a smile over a story about a dog. But none of it was a guarantee. None of it was the kind of knowing Nathan needed. "I don't know for certain," she said, "but I'm asking you to trust me. Not him. Me." Nathan looked at the floor. She watched the struggle in him, 13 years old and already so tired of hoping for things that didn't hold. "1 more month," he said finally. "I'll stay and see 1 more month." "Thank you," she said. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. But it was what they had, and she took it. What she did not know, and would not find out until later, was that Caleb had been in the main room and the hallway conversation had carried. He didn't say anything. That was his way. To hear a thing and carry it without announcing he was carrying it, to let it inform what he did rather than what he said. But the next morning, when the storm had broken and the world outside was white and still, and the temperature had come up enough to breathe without pain, Caleb came in from the morning chores and stopped beside Nathan, who was at the kitchen table with the ledger open. Nathan had taken to looking at the ledger. Nobody had asked him to. He had started doing it the way he did everything, because there was a problem, and he was the kind of person who could not be in the same room as a problem without trying to understand it. Caleb sat down across from him. "What do you see?" he said. Nathan looked up. What? In the accounts. What do you see? Nathan looked at him for a moment, checking whether this was real. Then he looked down at the ledger. The equipment debt is the worst thing. The interest is, you're paying almost as much in fees as you are on the principal. If you restructure it before January, you'll save. He did a quick calculation on the scrap paper beside the book. Something close to $40 over the year. Caleb looked at the numbers. Your mother said the same thing. She's right. I know. Caleb leaned back in his chair. I talked to the lender last Saturday. He agreed to restructure. He paused. I should have done it 2 years ago. Why didn't you? Nathan asked. He was asking honestly, not to be difficult. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When there's only one person responsible for everything, you get into the habit of pushing problems forward because there's no one else to catch them when you push them too far. You just keep moving. He looked at the window. You move fast enough, and sometimes you stop being able to tell the difference between managing something and just not dealing with it. Nathan considered this. That's what Mama does, he said. She moves fast. I've noticed, Caleb said. She's tired, Nathan said. He said it plainly, the way Ethan had said things plainly, but with a different weight behind it. Older, more specifically accurate. She doesn't show it, but she is. She's been tired since before Papa died. And she's spent 3 years since then trying to make sure nobody knows how tired she is, because if people know, they think she can't manage. And if they think she can't manage... He stopped. He'd said more than he meant to. Caleb was looking at him with an expression Nathan could not fully read. Not pity. Not that. Something more careful than that. She can manage, Caleb said. That's not in question. I know that, Nathan said. I know you know, Caleb said. I'm saying it anyway. Nathan looked at him. Then he looked back at the ledger. The store account, he said. She's going to have it down by 30% before the end of the month. She's been substituting what she can from what you grow, and she's already cut the weekly order by 1/3. I've noticed that too, Caleb said. There was a pause between them that was different from the earlier pauses. Not hostile, not full of calculation, just two people sitting with the shape of things as they actually were, which is not a comfortable shape but is a more honest one than most people allow themselves. I'm not leaving, Caleb said. Nathan looked up. I know you think I am, Caleb said, or that I will. I understand why you think that. I'm not going to tell you it's wrong to think it, because you've had enough reasons for it. He looked at Nathan directly, the way he had from the first day, without the condescension that Nathan had learned to expect from adults who were trying to manage him. But I'm not leaving. I want you to know that. Nathan held his gaze for a long moment, measuring, testing the ice. Why? He said. Not belligerent, genuinely asking. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Because this is the first time in 2 years this house has smelled like a home, he said, and I spent too long making it smell like nothing. Nathan said nothing. He looked back at the ledger. He moved his pencil and made a notation on the scrap paper and did not say anything for a while. But he didn't leave the table either, and after another few minutes he said, The north fence repair. Do you have enough wire? And Caleb said, Probably not. There's a merchant in the county south of here who sells it cheaper than the store in town. And Nathan said, How far? And Caleb said, Half a day. I was planning to go before January. And Nathan said, I'll come. And Caleb said, All right. And that was the closest thing to a treaty Nathan Hartwell had signed with any adult outside his own family since he was 10 years old. Molly found the wooden horse on the barn window ledge 3 days after the storm. She had been going to the barn most afternoons since they arrived. Not for any particular task, but because the barn had good light in the afternoon and she could sit on a hay bale with her back against the wall and draw without anyone asking her what she was drawing or why. Caleb had not questioned it. He'd seen her heading there on the second day and asked once, briefly, if she was all right with the horses, and she'd said she was. And he'd gone back to what he was doing. She found the wooden horse and picked it up. She turned it over. The paint was old, faded from red to a kind of dusty rose on the sides where hands had held it most. One back leg was missing, broken off at the joint, and the brake was old. Not recent, years old, the wood dried and lightened. She set it back on the ledge. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took out her pencil and her square of paper and she drew it. She drew the whole thing. The faded paint, the broken leg, the shape of something that had once been whole and was now a different kind of whole. She drew it for 20 minutes with the concentration she gave to everything she drew, which was the concentration of someone who believes that if you look at something long enough and carefully enough, you will understand it. She didn't know what she understood when she was done, but she folded the drawing and put it in her coat pocket and kept it. The afternoon things broke open arrived without announcement. It was a Sunday, 2.5 weeks after the storm. The sky was clear, the temperature above freezing for the first time in days, and the particular quality of light that comes off snow and afternoon sun was lying across everything in long, pale sheets. Nathan had been quieter than usual all morning. Evelyn had noticed, cataloged it, told herself it was the usual quiet. She was wrong about that. She was in the root cellar when Molly appeared at the top of the ladder. "Nathan left," Molly said. Evelyn's hands went still on the jar she was holding. "What do you mean left?" "He took his coat and his bag and he went down the east road. I saw him from the window." Evelyn was up the ladder before Molly finished the sentence. She came into the kitchen and through the main room and out the front door, and the cold hit her face, but she didn't go back for her coat. She stood on the porch and looked down the east road. She could see him. A small figure in a dark coat, walking, his bag on his back, already 200 yards down the road toward town. She heard the barn door behind her. Caleb came out and stood beside her and followed her gaze. Neither of them spoke for 2 seconds. Then Caleb said, "Go inside. Keep the children inside." He walked to the corral, unhitched his horse from the rail, mounted without going for a saddle, and rode. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched him go after her son. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat against her thighs and breathed through it and watched the distance close between the horse and the small dark figure on the road. And she told herself this was the moment that told you what a person was. Not the easy moments, not the soup and the lamp and the smile. This one. She went inside. Molly and Ethan were at the front window. Rose was on the floor with Ticket, who had come in during the commotion and not been told to leave. "Is Nathan going to be okay?" Ethan asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. She said it the way you say the thing that needs to be true. Nathan heard the horse before he saw it. He heard the hooves on the frozen road coming up behind him, and he walked faster, which he knew was pointless. And then he stopped walking and stood still and turned around and looked at Caleb Mercer riding toward him on the dark horse in the afternoon light. Caleb pulled up and dismounted in one motion. He didn't tie the horse. The horse stood where it was. Nathan stood with his bag on his back and his jaw set. He had been preparing what he was going to say for 2 hours, building the argument in his head, making it airtight, making sure Caleb couldn't refute the logic of it. Caleb didn't give him the chance to deliver it. He walked up to Nathan and he said, "I know what you're doing." Nathan said, "Then you know I'm right." "I know what you think you're doing," Caleb said, "and I know why. You think if you go, there's one less reason for this to fall apart. You think you're the number that makes the math too hard." "I'm not," Nathan started. "You are," Caleb said. Not cruel, just direct. "You've believed it for years. I'm not saying you're wrong to have believed it. You had enough evidence for it." He stopped 3 feet in front of Nathan. "But you don't have that evidence here, and I need you to hear that." Nathan looked at him. "You don't know what you're going to want in 6 months, or a year. Nobody does." "That's true," Caleb said. "I don't know that. Nobody knows that. But I'll tell you what I know right now." He looked at Nathan steadily. "I know that table in my house has been sitting with empty chairs for 2 years. I know that barn hadn't had a boy working in it since I built it. I know that this morning Ethan swept the shed floor without being asked, and Rose named my dog's favorite stick." He paused. "And I know that you checked the fence line on the south side of the property without being asked because you saw it needed doing and you did it. I know that." Nathan's jaw was still set, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Not opened, just shifted, like a door that has been braced from inside, giving slightly under a hand pressed to it. "You thought leaving would help your family," Caleb said. "But you being here is not a problem waiting to be subtracted. You're part of how this works." He looked at the boy in front of him, 13 years old and exhausted in a way no 13-year-old should be. "You thought if you removed yourself, things would be easier. But nothing about this house has been easier for your absence. It would just be emptier." Nathan looked down the road toward town. He looked back at Caleb. "What if it doesn't work?" he said. Quietly. The argument stripped away. Just the question underneath it. Then we deal with that when it happens, Caleb said. But we don't burn the house down to prevent a fire that hasn't started yet. A long silence. The horse behind Caleb shifted and settled. The cold afternoon light lay flat and clean over the frozen road. Nathan looked at his bag. He looked at the road. He looked at Caleb. He took the bag off his shoulder. Caleb reached out and took it from him. Just took the weight of it, simple, without making it into anything. Cold to be walking in, Caleb said. Yeah, Nathan said. His voice had something rough in it that he was working to control. Come on, Caleb said. He put the bag over his own shoulder and turned back toward the ranch, and Nathan fell into step beside him. And Caleb led the horse, and they walked back up the road together in the cold afternoon light, not talking, not needing to. 300 yards from the house, Nathan said, I found the wooden horse. Caleb kept walking. I know. In the barn. On the ledge. I know. Nathan was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry about your son. Caleb stopped walking. He stood still for just a moment. Then he said, Thank you. He said it the same way Ethan had said it in the shed, plain and whole and sufficient. They kept walking. At the porch steps, Evelyn was standing in the doorway. No coat, arms crossed against the cold, her face doing the thing where she held everything at an exact controlled distance that Caleb was starting to recognize as Evelyn Hartwell at the edge of her own composure. Nathan went up the steps. He stopped in front of her. He was as tall as her shoulder now, maybe taller. He looked at her face. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pulled him in and held him, and he let her, which was not something he had allowed in a long time. And she held on, and he held back, and they stood like that on the cold porch, until Ethan appeared in the doorway and said with 9-year-old precision, Can we please come back inside because it's freezing? And Nathan made a sound against her shoulder that was either a sob or a laugh, and she tightened her hold and didn't ask which. Caleb set the bag down by the door. He looked at the woman holding her oldest son on the porch of his house, and he did not say anything. He picked up the bag and took it inside and set it in the hallway and went to check the stove. He added wood. He put the kettle on. He stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the white yard and the bare trees and the long flat line of the plains beyond. And he let himself feel the weight of what was in this house now. The weight of people. The specific weight of people who were beginning, slowly, imperfectly, and with tremendous wariness on all sides, to belong to each other. He was not a man given to declarations, even internal ones. But he stood at the kitchen window while the kettle worked its way toward a boil, and he thought that the empty chairs were filling up in a way he had not expected, and in a way he did not have a name for yet, and that whatever word turned out to fit it, he was not sorry. He was not sorry at all. The kettle had long gone cold by the time Evelyn finally allowed herself to sit down that night. Nathan was asleep. All 4 children were asleep. The house had settled into its particular nighttime voice. The creak of the walls against the cold, the low tick of the stove contracting, the sound of ticket shifting under the porch. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, and she looked at the grain of it, and she let herself be tired. Not the managed tired she wore during the day, the functional tiredness that kept moving. The real kind. The kind that lived in the back of the knees and behind the eyes, and in the place at the base of the throat where things were held that couldn't be said in front of the children. She heard Caleb's door, then his footsteps. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and saw her at the table and stopped. Couldn't sleep, she said. Not a question. An explanation, offered before he could decide whether to ask. He came in and sat across from her. He didn't pour coffee. He didn't pick up the ledger. He just sat there the way he sometimes sat, present, without agenda, which was still something she was getting used to in a man. After a moment, he said, He's all right? I know, she said. He'll be all right. I know that too. She looked at her hands on the table. That's not what I'm sitting here about. He waited. She said, I keep thinking about how I almost didn't come. She said it to the table, not to him. The agency wrote to me about this arrangement in September. I said no. I wrote back and said no. I couldn't manage the travel. The children were too young for the disruption. It wasn't practical. She paused. Those were all true things. They were also not the reason. He said, What was the reason? She looked up. I had stopped believing that the number would ever stop being the problem. She held his gaze. 4 children. I had stopped believing any arrangement would survive the number, so I said no. And then I sat in a rooming house in Cheyenne for 6 more weeks, and the money ran lower, and the winter came, and I wrote back to the agency and said I had reconsidered. He was quiet. I didn't reconsider because I had hope, she said. I reconsidered because I had run out of alternatives. I need you to know that. I came here as a practical decision, not a hopeful one. She did not know exactly why she was telling him this at 11 o'clock at night in a cold kitchen. She knew only that it had been sitting in her chest since the afternoon, since Nathan on the porch, since the particular weight of a boy she'd almost lost to his own arithmetic, and it needed somewhere to go. Caleb said, I know. You know? I figured. He looked at the table, then at her. I also wrote to the agency 3 separate times before I actually went through with it. The first 2 times I withdrew before it got past the first exchange of letters. He paused. I told myself the ranch wasn't ready. The income wasn't stable enough. The house needed work. He met her eyes. Those were true things. She almost smiled. But not the reason. No, he said. Not the reason. The kitchen held them both for a moment. Outside the wind was low tonight, not the attacking kind, just the persistent presence of air moving across a flat land with nothing to stop it. What was your reason? She asked. Because he had asked her. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I had gotten very good at being alone, and I was afraid that being good at something might be the same as being all right with it, and I wasn't sure anymore. She looked at him. I still don't know if I'm all right with it, he said. But it turns out I'm not as good at it as I thought, because your children have been here 6 weeks, and I cannot remember what this house sounded like when they weren't in it, and I've tried. I've tried to remember because it seemed important to hold on to for some reason. He looked at the table. I can't. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, Caleb. He looked up. Thank you, she said, for going after him. There was no question of not going, he said. I know, she said. That's what I'm thanking you for. January came in hard and stayed hard. The kind of January that the frontier produced as a reminder of what the land was underneath the hospitable months. Indifferent, enormous, and completely unmoved by anyone's plans. The creek that ran along the south edge of the Mercer property froze solid enough to walk on by the second week. The cattle needed checking twice daily. The water in the horse trough had to be broken every morning with the back of an axe. Caleb worked it the way he always worked difficulty. Steadily, without particular complaint, with the focused attention of a man who has learned that objecting to weather is a waste of energy that could go toward dealing with it. What was different this January was that he wasn't doing it alone. Nathan rode with him on the morning checks 3 days a week. The boy had taken to horses with a thoroughness that surprised both of them. Not the romantic attachment of a child who likes the idea of horses, but the practical engagement of someone who found the animals sensible and the work logical and the early morning cold something to be managed rather than suffered. He didn't say much on these rides, neither did Caleb, but the silence between them had changed its quality since the afternoon on the East Road. It was a silence between 2 people who had said a hard thing and were now on the other side of it, where words were less necessary because the ground was clearer. Ethan had commandeered the shed with the woodworking tools to a degree that required a conversation. Caleb had it on a Tuesday, standing in the doorway of the shed, looking at the accumulated evidence of a 9-year-old's ambitions. 5 pieces of scrap wood in various states of being shaped into things that were not yet clearly identifiable. A floor thick with shavings despite regular sweeping. 2 of Caleb's chisels sharpened to a degree that actually improved them. You planning to set up a shop? Caleb said. Ethan turned around. He had sawdust in his hair and on his face, and an expression of complete unguilt. I'm making things. I can see that. What things? Ethan held up the piece he was currently working on. It was beginning to be a horse, roughly. The head was more or less right. The body was ambitious. Caleb looked at it. For Rose? For Molly, Ethan said. She draws everything. I thought she should have something to look at when she draws. Caleb looked at the wooden horse that was becoming something. Then he came into the shed, took off his coat, and picked up the broader chisel. Show me what you're going for with the neck, he said. I think I can show you a cut that'll make it easier. Ethan showed him. They worked on it together for an hour, Caleb showing, Ethan following, and by the end of the hour the neck was better and the legs were possible, and Ethan was looking at the thing with the particular satisfaction of someone who has understood a problem. "Mr. Mercer," Ethan said, not looking up from the wood. "Hmm? Why do you keep the rattle?" Caleb's hand stopped. Ethan looked up. I'm not trying to be rude. I just saw it on the table one night. I wondered." Caleb set the chisel down. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the wall of the shed for a moment. "Because it was going to be his," he said. "My son. I was going to need it, and then he didn't, and it seemed wrong to put it away somewhere and forget it." He paused. "I don't know if that makes sense." "It makes sense," Ethan said. He looked back at the wood. "I kept my father's handkerchief, the one from his coat pocket. Mama doesn't know." He worked the chisel carefully. "I don't know why I kept it from her. I just did." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "Things like that belong to you," he said finally. "You don't have to explain them." Ethan nodded. He kept working. Caleb picked up the other chisel and kept working beside him, and neither of them said anything else. And it was the right kind of nothing. Well, the trouble that had been accumulating in Blackwater Crossing arrived at the ranch on a Friday afternoon in the form of a man named Gerald Holt. Evelyn was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon. She looked out the window and saw a man she didn't recognize pulling up in a good wagon behind a matched pair of horses that spoke to money, or at least the appearance of it. He was somewhere in his 50s, thick in the shoulders, wearing a coat that was better than anything worn in Blackwater Crossing on a regular basis. He sat in the wagon with the posture of a man accustomed to arriving places and being received. Caleb came out of the barn. Evelyn watched from the window. She couldn't hear what passed between them from the kitchen. She watched the body language, Caleb with his arms at his sides. Not hostile, but not open. The posture he had when he was being careful. The man in the good coat gesturing toward the south field, then back toward the house. Then at a piece of paper he produced from inside his coat. She went to the front room and opened the window 2 inches. The cold came in immediately. She ignored it. "Made the same offer to Patterson, and he took it," the man was saying. His voice was smooth in the way that had been practiced into smoothness, the kind of voice that had learned to sound reasonable. $350 for the south acreage. That's fair market value in this county, Mercer. You can verify it yourself. "I've had no intention of selling the south acreage," Caleb said. "Intentions change," the man said. "Circumstances change. You've had a hard couple of years. Everyone in the county knows that. Taking on additional..." A pause, and Evelyn understood the pause, understood exactly what it contained. Additional expenses would seem to make a man reconsider his positions. "Is that what you heard?" Caleb said. "That I'd taken on expenses?" "I heard you'd taken on a widow and 4 children," the man said. "Which amounts to the same thing, realistically speaking." Evelyn's hand tightened on the window frame. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, and had something underneath the evenness that was not. "Gerald, I'm going to say this once. The south acreage is not for sale. The rest of this property is not for sale. My financial situation is my business, and what I have or haven't taken on is no part of this conversation." "I'm offering you a clean exit before the weight gets heavier," Holt said. Still smooth, still reasonable. The tone of a man who had said this enough times to people in enough bad situations that he had honed it to its most effective form. "The offer stands through the end of the month. After that it'll still not be for sale," Caleb said. "Have a good afternoon." He turned and walked back toward the barn. Holt sat in his wagon for a moment, looking after him with the expression of a man recalculating. Then he clicked his horses forward and drove back the way he came. Evelyn closed the window. She stood in the middle of the front room with her heart doing something fast and unpleasant, and her mind already moving through the shape of what she'd heard, the information and the space between the information. Patterson, Holt had said. Patterson had taken the offer. She knew the name. She knew it from the accounts, from a conversation with Dora Phelps at the store, from the general geography of who owned what in this county. Patterson's land bordered the south side of the Mercer property. If Holt had bought Patterson out and was now pushing on the south acreage, she was at the kitchen table with the county map she'd found in the desk drawer before Caleb came in from the barn. He stopped in the doorway and saw her with the map. "You heard," he said. "I opened the window," she said. "Who is Gerald Holt?" Caleb came in and sat down and looked at the map. "Land consolidator. He's been buying up acreage in this county for 4 years, smaller plots, mostly from ranchers who had a bad season or two. Sells on to developers, mostly. There's a railroad branch being planned for the eastern part of the county. Not confirmed yet, but the land near any potential line is worth considerably more than it looks right now. And your south acreage sits at the most logical point for a line coming in from the east. He said it without particular drama. I've known he'd come eventually. Have you talked to anyone about this? A lawyer? I talked to this county clerk last spring. The land is titled clearly. He can't force a sale. He paused. But he can make things uncomfortable enough that a man in a bad position starts to think the offer looks better than it did. Evelyn looked at the map. What's he already bought? Caleb pointed. Patterson's old plot. A smaller parcel to the north, which had belonged to a family named Reeves, that she'd heard mentioned once and not since. A strip of land running along the eastern boundary of the county that, when she looked at it against the shape of the Mercer property, formed a kind of bracket, not quite surrounding, but beginning to. He's been doing this deliberately, she said. Yes. He's been buying the land around you so you feel like you're in a corner. Yes. She looked up from the map. Does he know the railroad route is confirmed? Caleb met her eyes. He acts like a man who knows more than public record. She sat with that. If the route is confirmed, the south acreage isn't worth $350. It's worth more, Caleb said. Considerably more. She looked at the map. She looked at Caleb. What does he have on you? Financially, what does he actually have? Nothing, Caleb said. The restructure went through. The store account is coming down. You know that better than I do. The equipment debt is manageable. He paused. On paper, I have nothing that gives him leverage. But he came anyway, she said. He came anyway, Caleb confirmed. She tapped the map at the Patterson plot. I want to talk to some people in town. Not at the store. At the county office. I want to see the public records on these sales. She looked at him. Do you want me to do that? I don't want to step into something that isn't my... Do it, he said. Not please. Not thank you in advance, just do it. The way he said things when he meant them completely. She nodded. She went into Blackwater Crossing on Monday with Nathan, who wanted to come and whose company she wanted without being able to say exactly why. He was useful in the way of someone who noticed things she might be looking at too directly to see. The county clerk was a thin man named Aldous Webb, who had the cautious manner of someone in a job that required him to be pleasant to everyone, regardless of his personal assessments, and who had developed over the years a very precise language for what he could and could not confirm. Evelyn put her request plainly. She wanted to see the recorded sales for the parcels she named. Mr. Webb confirmed that these were public record and produced the relevant ledgers with the efficiency of a man for whom this was a routine task. They were routine, in one sense. In another sense, they were not. She looked at the dates of the sales. She looked at the recorded prices. She looked at Nathan, who was looking at the same numbers. Patterson sold in August, Nathan said quietly. The summer the railroad survey team came through, she said, equally quiet. The survey team that Holt would have had access to if he had the right connections, she said. Webb was not looking at them. He was at his own desk, attending to something else with professional disinterest. Evelyn looked at the Reeves parcel sale. October. Also after the survey. Also at a price that made sense only if the buyer knew something the seller did not. She closed the ledger and thanked Mr. Webb and walked out with Nathan. On the street, Nathan said, he knew. He knew the route before anyone else did, she said, or he knew someone who knew. Is that illegal? I don't know, she said. I need to find out. How? She looked down the street toward the telegraph office at the far end. The railroad company will have an office in Denver. Someone there will know the official status of the route and the timing of when it became known. She started walking. And there may be lawyers in Denver who know more about how men like Holt operate. Nathan kept pace with her. You're going to telegraph Denver? I'm going to telegraph Denver, she said. He was quiet for half a block. Then, he's not going to like it when he finds out. No, she said. He won't. You're going to do it anyway. She looked at him sideways. Yes. He almost smiled. The particular smile that was his, not wide, just a slight shift at the corner of the mouth, the expression of someone seeing something confirmed they had hoped was true. "Okay," he said. They walked to the telegraph office. The telegram came back on Wednesday. She had it in her hand when Caleb came in from the afternoon check. She set it on the table in front of him and let him read it. He read it twice. The railroad company's Denver office confirmed that the Eastern County branch route had been formally surveyed and the findings submitted internally in June. The survey findings were not public record until October. A company representative confirmed that the findings had been shared with a small number of contracted land agents in advance of public filing. Standard practice for coordinated acquisition, the telegram said, which was a phrase that Evelyn had read 3 times and found professionally repellent each time. "Contracted land agents," Caleb said. "Holt has a contract with the railroad," Evelyn said. "He buys the land they want cheaply before people know it's valuable. The railroad gets it from him later at a price that still saves them money over market. He profits from the spread." Caleb set the telegram down. He looked at it on the table. "Patterson didn't know," he said. It was not a question. "Patterson sold for $340, she said. "The same plot is worth at minimum $800 now. Probably more when the line is confirmed publicly." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Reeves the same," she said. Caleb was very still. She had seen this stillness before. It was not the stillness of a man doing nothing. It was the stillness of a man holding something very tightly that wanted to move in a direction he was deciding not to let it. "What are my options?" he said. "I think there are 3, she said. She had been thinking about them since the telegram arrived. First, sell to Holt now, before the route is public, and at least know that what you get is certain. I'm not recommending this, I'm listing it. Go on. Second, hold and wait for the route to go public, at which point the south acreage value is clear and Holt's leverage is gone. This requires that he doesn't find another way to pressure you in the meantime. And third? Third, she said, you talk to Patterson and Reeves, if you can find him. Because if they can demonstrate that they were sold to under conditions they didn't have the information to evaluate fairly, there may be a legal argument." She paused. "I don't know enough about the law to know if it would hold, but I know someone who might." "The lawyer in Denver," he said. "There's a woman, a former colleague of my husband's, not a lawyer herself, but she knows one who handled railroad disputes. I can write to her." She looked at him. "This would take time, and it might not come to anything." Caleb sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, not dramatically, just the posture of a man running through something complex in his head and needing the space to do it. "You've been thinking about this since Monday," he said. "Since Saturday," she said. "Since the window." He looked at her. "You were listening through the window." "I opened it 2 inches, she said. The information seemed relevant." Something moved through his expression, not quite the near miss of a smile, closer to the actual thing. "You opened the window," he said. "In my defense, you were right outside it." "Evelyn." "Yes." "Thank you," he said. He said it the way he said things that he meant past the point of casual expression, quiet, direct, weighted with the sincerity of a person who does not say things they do not mean. She nodded. She reached across the table and picked up the telegram and folded it. "I'll write the letter tonight, and in the meantime I think you should go talk to Patterson." "He'll be embarrassed," Caleb said, "finding out what he sold for." "I know," she said. "People are sometimes more willing to act when they're embarrassed than when they're just wronged. It's not a noble impulse, but it's a reliable one." Caleb looked at her with the expression she had been seeing more often lately, the one that was not assessment exactly, but was related to it. Like a man confirming something he had been increasingly certain of and finding that certainty still surprising. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. She said, "Necessity." She stood up and went to the stove to check the heat. "And 6 weeks of a husband's railroad accounts." The conversation with Patterson happened the following Saturday. Caleb went alone. He came back 2 hours later and sat at the kitchen table and said, "He's angry." "At Holt?" Evelyn asked. "At Holt. At himself. At the world in general, which is understandable." He folded his hands on the table. "But he'll talk to whoever needs to talk to him, if it amounts to something. He said Reeves is living with his daughter now, 20 miles south. He thinks Reeves will want to talk." "Good," Evelyn said. "He also said," Caleb paused, He looked at the table. He said he'd heard Holt had been talking to people, specifically, about the ranch. He met her eyes. About you. About whether a man with an arrangement like this one was really stable enough to hold property for the long term. The kitchen went still. He's using us, she said. Not a question. He's using the fact of you being here as an argument for my instability, Caleb said. The idea being that a man who takes on a widow and 4 children in a moment of, he stopped and the line of his jaw went hard, of whatever the implication is a man who makes poor decisions. Evelyn sat down. She placed both hands on the table in front of her and looked at them. She was breathing evenly. She was doing the thing she did, managing it, holding it at the exact distance that let her stay functional. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Then Molly appeared in the kitchen doorway, stopped when she saw their faces, and said, "Is something wrong?" "No," Evelyn said. "Steady." Molly looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "We're working through some business. Nothing for you to worry about." Molly looked between them with the precise, unsettling attention of an 11-year-old who drew people's hands and kept things in her pockets. Then she said, "All right," and left. After her footsteps faded, Caleb said, "Evelyn." She looked up. "He can say what he wants about my decisions," he said. "He doesn't know what my decisions are. He doesn't know what's in this house." His voice was even, more even than it usually was, which meant he was working at it. "I need you to know that his using you as an argument doesn't change what I think the decision was." She held his gaze. "Gaze? What decision?" "To write back to the agency," he said, the 3rd time. He looked at her without looking away. "It was the right decision, whatever Holt or anyone else makes of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Write to Patterson. Get the name of where Reeves is, and let me write to Denver tonight." He said, "All right." She stood up and went to the desk in the front room and took out paper and a pen and began to write. She wrote clearly and without wasted words, the way she wrote everything, the way she had learned to write when letters were the only currency she could spend freely. She wrote until the lamp needed turning up. She wrote until the house was dark around her except for her small circle of light. She wrote until she heard Caleb in the kitchen putting the stove to bed for the night, banking the fire the way he always did, checking the wood box. She heard him stop in the doorway of the front room. "Come to bed," he said, quietly. Not a command, just the words. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with the hallway dark behind him, and he looked like what he was. A man in his home, at the end of a hard day, tired in the way that came from caring about things that could be lost. "5 more minutes," she said. He nodded. He went to bed. She looked at the letter on the desk. She looked at the lamp. She thought about the woman she had been in Cheyenne in September, counting 4 children and counting money, and telling herself she had run out of alternatives. She thought about all the ways that had been true and all the ways it had not been the whole truth. She had run out of alternatives. She had also, without letting herself name it, been hoping. She signed the letter. She folded it and sealed it. She turned down the lamp and sat in the dark for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of what was in this house. Not just what was at risk, not just what Holt was trying to take, but what it would mean to lose it, what it would mean that she would lose. And that told her, more clearly than any accounting she had done, exactly what she had allowed herself to want. She sat with that in the dark. Then she got up and went to bed, and she slept. And when she woke in the morning, the letter was on the desk waiting to be sent, and the fire was already going in the kitchen. And somewhere in the barn, she could hear the sound of her oldest son talking to a horse in the patient, practical way he talked to things he had decided to trust. And the morning came in cold and clear and full of what had not been settled, and what, despite that, was being built. The letter reached Denver in 4 days. The reply took 9. Evelyn checked the post office in Blackwater Crossing on each of those 9 days without telling anyone she was checking, working it into the Saturday supply run, then inventing reasons to go to town on Tuesday, then on Thursday. Caleb noticed on the 3rd trip. He said nothing. He came with her on the 4th, and when she went into the post office and came out empty-handed, he simply turned the wagon back toward the ranch, without asking the question she didn't have an answer to yet. That patience cost him something, she knew. It wasn't the easy kind. He had his own relationship with waiting. She had learned that about him over these months, the way waiting sat on him heavier than work. The way uncertainty was the one thing his practical, forward-moving nature had no good mechanism for. He managed it by keeping his hands busy. He repaired the south fence. He reorganized the barn. He started a second woodworking project alongside Ethan in the shed, something larger, something she couldn't yet identify from the pieces. She didn't ask. She let him have the shed the way he let her have the desk at night. On the 9th day, the reply was there. She stood in the post office and read it once, quickly, for the shape of it. Then she went outside and sat on the wagon bench and read it again, slowly, for the detail. Caleb was beside her. He waited. "The lawyer's name is Samuel Greer," she said. "He's handled 3 cases in Colorado Territory involving railroad land agents operating on insider survey access. 2 of them settled in favor of the original landowners." She looked up. "He says the legal ground is thin but not non-existent. It depends on whether the railroad's internal policy on pre-public disclosure can be shown to constitute a form of fraudulent inducement." Caleb repeated the phrase carefully. Fraudulent inducement. If Holt represented himself as making a fair market offer when he knew the market was about to change significantly, if Patterson and Reeves can testify that Holt gave them no indication of the railroad survey, then there's an argument that the sales weren't made on equal terms. "That's a long way from proving it," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at the letter over her shoulder. "What does he want to do?" "He wants to come here," she said. "He wants to talk to Patterson and Reeves himself. He says he needs 3 weeks. She looked at Caleb. "He charges $8 a day plus expenses." Caleb looked at the road ahead. He did the arithmetic in his head the way he always did, silently, his jaw set. 3 weeks. $8 a day. It was not a small amount. It was not a catastrophic amount either, not with the accounts where they were, but it was real, and it would be felt. "Tell him to come," Caleb said. She wrote back that afternoon. Samuel Greer arrived on a Wednesday in late January, on the afternoon train, and was not what either of them expected. He was younger than the formality of his letters had suggested, somewhere in his mid-30s, with an open face that had not yet learned to be guarded in the way of older lawyers, and a coat that was good quality but had a button missing on the left cuff that he appeared not to have noticed. He shook Caleb's hand and then Evelyn's hand with equal attention, which she noted and appreciated. He spent the first evening at the kitchen table with the county records Evelyn had copied from the clerk's office, the telegram from the railroad company's Denver representative, and a cup of coffee he kept forgetting to drink. He asked questions in the ordered, methodical way of someone working through a structure, not performing intelligence but actually applying it. At 9 o'clock he sat back and said, "Tell me about Holt." Caleb described him, the visit, the pitch, the particular phrase about additional expenses, and the particular pause that had contained 4 children's worth of implication. Greer wrote it down. "He said that in front of witnesses?" "My wife heard it from the window," Caleb said. Then he stopped. He looked at Evelyn, and she saw the moment he registered what he had said, the word he had used, and the expression on his face was not embarrassment exactly, but something more precise than that. A man who had said a true thing before he finished deciding whether he was ready to say it. Evelyn looked at the table. Greer wrote something down. "That's useful. Statements made at the time of an approach carry weight." He looked at Caleb. "What he said about your domestic situation, specifically, the framing of additional expenses as indicative of instability. That's a pattern I've seen before. It's part of the pressure method. Make the target feel that their circumstances are being watched, being judged, that the offer is coming from a position of superior knowledge about their vulnerability." He set his pen down. "It's designed to make you feel smaller than you are." "I know what it was designed to do," Caleb said. "I know you do," Greer said. "I'm saying it for the record, because when we talk to Patterson, it will help him recognize the same pattern in his own experience. People are more willing to speak up about being manipulated when they understand it was a method, not just a conversation." The meeting with Patterson happened on Friday. Evelyn drove out with Greer in the morning. Caleb stayed at the ranch, partly because 2 men arriving felt like a confrontation, and 1 woman and a lawyer felt more like a conversation, and partly because Patterson had said something to Caleb the previous week that suggested old friction between them, nothing specific, just the particular friction of 2 men who had competed for the same resources for too long in too small a county. Silas Patterson was in his 60s, a man shaped by decades of physical work into something that looked both strong and tired simultaneously. His wife brought coffee without being asked. His kitchen smelled like wood smoke and something baking. He sat at his table and looked at Greer and then at Evelyn and said, "You're the widow." "I'm Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of revised attention, as though she had been one thing in his mind before she spoke and was now beginning to be something else. "Mercer's lucky," he said. Not to her, to the table. Then he picked up his coffee. Greer walked him through it carefully. What Holt had said. The timing of the survey. The price versus the value. Patterson listened without interrupting, which Evelyn suspected was not his natural mode. He listened with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and his jaw tight, and something building behind his eyes that was not quite anger yet, but was anger's precondition. When Greer finished, Patterson said, "He told me the land was worth what he offered. He said he'd had it assessed." "He had it assessed," Greer said, "against current recorded market value, not against what the market was about to become." "That's a distinction most people wouldn't think to question," Patterson said. "That's why the method works," Greer said. Patterson was quiet for a long moment. His wife, who had been standing near the stove and had said nothing through any of this, said quietly, "Silas." He looked at her. "Tell them about the letter," she said. Patterson set his cup down. He stood up, went to the shelf beside the door, and took down a small wooden box. From the box, he removed a folded piece of paper and set it on the table in front of Greer. It was a letter, signed by Gerald Holt. 3 sentences that amounted to a written confirmation of the offer, the price, and a phrase at the end that Evelyn read twice, "Fair value per current county assessment." Greer looked at the letter. He looked at Evelyn. She saw it in his face before he said it. "This," he said, "is considerably more useful than I expected." Reeves was found and spoken to. He had no letter, but he had a memory that was detailed and a daughter who had been present during his meeting with Holt and who had her own recollections, consistent with her father's, about what Holt had said regarding the land's value and prospects. Greer spent a week in Blackwater Crossing gathering, organizing, writing. He worked at Caleb's kitchen table in the evenings and at the county clerk's office in the mornings. He ate Evelyn's cooking without comment and then, on the 4th evening, said simply, "Mrs. Hartwell, I have eaten in hotels across 4 territories and this is better," which was the most uncomplicated compliment she had received in recent memory and which she accepted with equal plainness. The children orbited him with varying degrees of curiosity. Rose asked him directly what a lawyer did, and he explained it in terms that Rose found satisfying enough to relay to Ticket in full detail later. Ethan asked him whether lawyers were good at math, and Greer said that the good ones were, and Ethan looked at him with reassessed respect. Molly drew him, which he didn't know until she showed him on the 6th day. A pencil sketch of him at the table with his papers, his head bent, his missing button visible, accurate in the way that made him look up at her and say, "That's quite something," in a voice that was not performing surprise. Nathan asked him if they were going to win. Greer looked at Nathan with the direct honesty of someone who had decided early in his career that lying to clients about their prospects was professionally efficient in the short term and disastrous in every other sense. "I think we have a reasonable case," he said. "I don't promise outcomes, but I'll tell you what I think our strongest arguments are and why, if you want." Nathan sat down. "Yes," he said. "I want." Greer told him. Nathan listened with the ledger attention he brought to everything numerical, asking 2 questions that Greer answered with the slight pause of someone registering that the question was better than he'd anticipated. After Nathan left, Greer said to Evelyn, "How old is he?" 13, she said. Greer looked at the door Nathan had gone through. "He should study law." Evelyn felt something happen in her chest that was not small. "I'll tell him you said so," she said. Holt's response to being contacted by Greer was what Greer had predicted it would be: aggressive, then calculating, then, when the letter from Patterson was mentioned, very quiet. The quiet was more informative than the aggression. Greer went to meet him in the county seat on a Thursday, alone, which was intentional. He came back that evening and sat at the kitchen table, and Caleb and Evelyn sat across from him, and he said, "He wants to negotiate." Caleb said, "Meaning what?" meaning he wants to resolve this without a formal filing. He's proposed supplemental payments to Patterson and Reeves, not full restitution, but significant. And he's proposing to withdraw his interest in the Mercer South acreage formally and in writing. The kitchen was very quiet. He's afraid of the letter, Evelyn said. He's afraid of the letter, and he's afraid of a filing that becomes public record, Greer said. A man in his business cannot afford to have a documented pattern of this kind of acquisition. It closes doors. He looked at Caleb. The railroad contract in particular. If the railroad believes he's a liability, it ends his operation, Caleb said. It significantly diminishes it, yes. Caleb sat back. He looked at the table. He looked at Evelyn. And the look was a question that was not really a question because she could see he had already formed his own answer, but he was asking anyway because that was something that had shifted between them in these months without either of them declaring it. The habit of checking with each other, not for permission, but for the thing that comes from being honest with someone you trust. She said, "What does Patterson want?" Greer said, "Patterson wants his money and a formal acknowledgement. The acknowledgement is more important to him than the amount." "Then he should have it," Caleb said. "And the South acreage withdrawal in writing," Evelyn said. "Witnessed and filed with the county clerk. Not just a letter, a filed document." Greer looked at her. "Agreed," he said. "I'll include that in the terms." "And Reeves," she said. "And Reeves," Greer confirmed. Caleb said, "How long?" 2 weeks to draft and execute," Greer said. "Assuming Holt doesn't try to revise the terms back toward his favor, which he'll attempt once." He said it with the flat certainty of someone who had seen this particular dance before. "I'll hold the line." "All right," Caleb said. Greer closed his notebook. He picked up his forgotten coffee and drank it cold without making a face. "I'll tell you something," he said. "In 3 cases like this one, I've never had a client come to me with the documentation as organized as what you had prepared." He looked at Evelyn. "The telegram, the copied records, the timeline, that's what made this possible to pursue." Evelyn said, "I spent 9 years managing accounts for a man who thought they managed themselves. I learned what organized looks like by watching what disorganized cost." Greer nodded once. "Well," he said, "it served you here." The agreement was filed on the 14th of February. Evelyn knew the date was going to mean something to other people and resolved to let it mean only what it was. The day a document was filed and a threat was formally ended and 3 families in one small county got back. If not everything they had lost, at least the acknowledgement that what had been taken was taken unfairly. Patterson received a supplemental payment. Reeves received a supplemental payment. The Mercer South acreage was formally and permanently withdrawn from any claim by Gerald Holt or affiliated parties. The document witnessed, signed, and filed where it would remain as long as paper and county records held. Holt did not come back to Blackwater Crossing after that. He moved his operations east, Greer reported in a follow-up letter. Whether the railroad contract survived, he couldn't say with certainty. Whether he found other properties and other sellers who didn't have the particular combination of a careful woman and a filed letter working against him, that Greer also couldn't say. The world did not always provide the clean conclusion of a man comprehensively stopped. Sometimes what you got was a man redirected, a specific harm prevented, a specific piece of ground held. Caleb said it was enough. Evelyn said she agreed with that, and she did, mostly, though she spent one evening thinking about all the Patterson equivalents in other counties who hadn't had the letter or the lawyer or the woman with the organized timeline, and she let herself be angry about that for an hour, and then she folded it away and went back to what was in front of her. What was in front of her was a life that was very quietly and without ceremony becoming real. She did not know exactly when the shift happened. That was the honest answer. There was no single moment she could point to and say, "There, that was when." It was more like the way ice thaws, not all at once, but in the accumulation of small releases, each one minor, the whole thing irreversible. She had stopped waiting for it to fall apart. That was part of it. The waiting had been a habit she'd maintained for months, the way you maintain a defensive posture long after the threat has passed, because the body remembers what it cost to drop it last time. Somewhere between the storm and the East Road and the kitchen at 11 o'clock and the filing of a document in a county clerk's office, the posture had eased. She didn't notice it happening. She only noticed, one morning in early March, that she had gone an entire day without calculating the exit, without running the numbers on what she would do if this ended, without holding herself slightly apart from the fact of the house and the man in it and the particular accumulated life of it. She was making breakfast. The light was coming through the window at the angle that meant spring was thinking about arriving. She could hear Caleb in the barn and Ethan in the shed and Molly somewhere with her paper, and Rose was still asleep, which was Rose's position on mornings in general. And Nathan was at the kitchen table with the ledger and a pencil and a piece of paper covered in calculations, and he looked up when she set his coffee down and said, "The equipment debt is going to be fully retired by September." "I know," she said. "That's 4 months ahead of where it was when we came." "I know that too." He looked at the ledger. He looked at the window. He said, "Mama, I think it's going to be okay here." She looked at her oldest son, 13.5 years old, with his father's dark eyes and his own particular hard-won brand of attention, sitting at a kitchen table doing accounts before breakfast, because the accounts were his chosen way of loving a place, of making himself part of its functioning, of belonging to it without having to say in words that he belonged. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." He nodded. He went back to the ledger. She went back to the stove. The conversation she and Caleb had been not quite having since November finally happened on a Thursday evening in March, which was an ordinary Thursday in every external way. Dishes done, children in various states of winding toward bed, fire in the main room burning low, the usual quiet of the house after 8 o'clock. He was at the kitchen table. She was at the desk. She heard him set his pen down. "Evelyn." She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had catalogued all winter, the one that was not assessment but was related to it, the one that appeared when he was about to say something he had been carrying. He had it now at full strength, uncomplicated by the usual careful management. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, which I know you will, but I'm saying it anyway because the thing I'm asking is—" He stopped. He picked up his pen and set it back down. She had rarely seen him uncertain. It was, she thought, one of the most real things she had seen on his face. "It's not a small thing." She turned the desk chair to face him. "Ask it," she said. He looked at her. "I'd like this to be permanent," he said, "not the arrangement. I want to be clear. I'm not talking about the arrangement. I'm talking about—" He gestured once at the space between them, at the house, at the unmistakable fact of what had been built in these months without either of them formally naming it. "I'm talking about all of it. You and me and the children. A marriage. A family. This, but with nothing provisional about it." The kitchen held very still. "I'm not saying it the way it should probably be said," he said. "I know that. I'm not good at this particular kind of talking, but I mean it completely, and I'd rather say it badly and mean it than say it well and have you wonder." She looked at him. This man who had built a table with 6 chairs for a family that hadn't come yet, who had left a lamp burning, who had gone after her son in the cold with no hesitation and no calculation, who had taken her honestly and let himself be taken honestly in return, imperfectly and incompletely, and with significant amounts of not talking, and still, somehow, with a kind of thoroughness that she had not expected and could not now imagine having missed. "I know you mean it," she said. "Is that a yes?" She looked at him for another moment, not making him wait. She had made her decision somewhere she couldn't precisely locate, in the dark of a morning or the middle of an accounts page, or the moment she watched him carry her sleeping daughter down a hallway. She genuinely could not say exactly when. But she looked at him for a moment because she wanted to look at him, because she wanted to register it. The man in the kitchen in the lamplight who was saying a hard thing badly and meaning it completely. "Yes," she said. "That's a yes." He breathed out. It was not a dramatic exhalation. It was the breath of a man who has been holding something without knowing he was holding it, and the release of it was quiet and real and entirely unperformed. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He picked up his pen. She turned back to the desk. The fire in the main room ticked and settled. Outside, the March wind moved across the plains with slightly less aggression than it had all winter, as though the season itself was reconsidering its position. It was, she thought, the least romantic proposal in the history of the institution. It was also the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her by some measure, and she had reached the age of 31 with enough experience of the alternatives to know which one she preferred. They told the children the next morning at breakfast. Rose said, "So he's staying forever?" "We're all staying forever," Evelyn said. Rose processed this. "Can Ticket sleep inside now?" "No," said Evelyn. "That seems like a flaw in the plan," Rose said, and went back to her porridge. Ethan said, "Does this mean we call you something different?" He was looking at Caleb with the direct, slightly interrogating gaze of a 9-year-old who treats nomenclature as a serious matter. Caleb said, "You can call me whatever feels right." Ethan considered this. "I'll think about it," he said, which was Ethan's version of taking something seriously. Molly said nothing for a moment. She looked at her mother. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she looked back at her plate. Then she said, quietly but clearly, "I'm glad." That was all. But Molly was not a person who said things lightly, and the weight of 2 words from Molly was the weight of a paragraph from most people. And Evelyn felt it in the specific place she kept things that mattered past the point of comfortable acknowledgement. Nathan, who had been eating steadily through all of this, set his fork down when the table went quiet. He looked at Caleb across the table. His jaw was in the position it went to when he was working through something complex. Not hostile, just processing. Then he said, "Okay." Caleb met his eyes. "Okay," he said. That was their version of a ceremony. It was enough. It was, in fact, precisely enough. And Evelyn understood something in that moment about the difference between what things look like from the outside and what they are from the inside, and how the whole of this, the train platform, the counted children, the long winter, the storm, the East Road, the desk at midnight, the filed document, the kitchen at 11 o'clock, had never looked like much from the outside, had looked from the outside like the modest circumstances of people doing their best with what they had, which was true, and also entirely insufficient as a description. They married in April, not in a church. In the yard of the ranch, on a morning when the frost was still on the ground at 8 o'clock but was gone by 9, with a justice of the peace from the county seat who was businesslike and kind in equal measure, and Dora Phelps from the general store who had, over the winter, revised her professionally polite warmth into something that was beginning to approach the real thing, and Patterson and his wife, who came because Caleb asked them, and because it was the kind of gesture Patterson understood, the kind that cost nothing but mattered. Rose wore a ribbon Molly had braided into her hair and spent the ceremony watching a bird on the fence post with equal attention to the proceedings. Ethan stood straight and held still, which was his version of ceremony. Molly had her paper in her pocket. She drew it afterward. Not the ceremony itself, but the yard, the particular quality of the April light, Caleb's hand and Evelyn's hand, the fence post with the bird that Rose had watched. Nathan stood beside Caleb, not behind him, not at a distance, not at the measured remove of a boy keeping his options open. He stood beside him, which was where he had chosen to stand, which nobody had asked him to choose, which was therefore the only position that meant anything. When the justice said the words that concluded the matter, and Caleb turned and looked at Evelyn with the expression she had been learning all winter, the one that was not performing anything, the one that was just him, looking at her, being seen. Nathan put his hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder, just for a moment, just enough to be a thing and not a gesture. Caleb put his hand over Nathan's hand for the same duration. Then they both looked forward, and the moment closed over itself like water. She saw it. She would carry it the rest of her life. The table, by summer, had a problem. The problem was that 6 chairs were no longer enough, not because of a catastrophic expansion of the household, but because Patterson's son, who was 17 and had taken to riding over on Saturday afternoons to work alongside Nathan on whatever the current ranch project was, had fallen into the habit of staying for dinner without it being formally arranged. And because Greer, who returned to the area on another matter in June and came out to the ranch for what was supposed to be an afternoon, ended up staying 3 days and eating every meal. And because Dora Phelps' niece was visiting from back east and came once for Sunday dinner, and then, because the visit stretched, came again. The table held 8 people on a Saturday in July, which required 2 chairs from the front room and a general reorganization of the seating arithmetic. And at the end of dinner, when Rose was asleep in her chair and the conversation had gone wide and easy and the evening light was long through the window, Evelyn looked at the table, at the people around it, at the mismatched chairs pulled in from other rooms, At the plates scraped clean and the cups refilled and the particular loud, comfortable disorder of a meal that had outgrown its container. And she thought about the woman who had stood on a train platform in November counting 4 children and the ways in which everything she counted had been wrong. Not the number. The number was right. There were 4 children, and there always would have been 4 children, and that was not what she had miscounted. She had miscounted the value. She had spent 3 years taking the number that men used against her and agreeing with its meaning, accepting the arithmetic of other people's limitations as though it were a law of nature, as though the 4 of them were a debt rather than a fortune, as though she had been walking around all those years not knowing she was carrying exactly what someone was waiting to receive. That was the thing she had been wrong about, not the number, the nature of it. She had not arrived at Blackwater Crossing carrying too much. She had arrived carrying the precise and specific things this house and this man had been missing, and the fact that the world had consistently told her otherwise said nothing about the truth of it. It said only that the world had been wrong, and that the world was sometimes wrong in very loud and convincing ways that could, if you were not careful, become the voice inside your own head. She had been not careful. For years she had been not careful. And she had paid for it in the currency of diminished expectation, in the practiced numbness of a woman who had learned to stop hoping before the hoping could be disappointed. She did not blame herself for that. She understood it too clearly to blame it. When something fails enough times, the mind learns to protect itself by failing first, by preemptively reducing what it allows itself to want. That is not weakness. That is a person surviving by available means. But it is also a cost. And the cost is everything on the other side of it, everything you would have wanted if you had let yourself. She had let herself. Eventually, imperfectly, with great caution and considerable stubbornness, she had let herself. And on the other side of it was this table, this summer evening, these people, this man at the end of it, who caught her eye across the length of the table and held it for a moment with no expression that required translation, because after a winter and a spring of learning each other's languages, she no longer needed translation. He looked at the overcrowded table. He looked back at her. He said, not loudly, "I'm going to need a bigger table." She said, "Yes, you are." He said, "I'll start on it this week." She said, "Good." Around them the conversation continued, and Rose slept in her chair, and Nathan laughed at something Patterson's son said. The genuine laugh that had come back to him slowly over these months. The laugh of a boy who had been shown enough times that the floor was solid, that he had started to trust it, and Molly was drawing on the back of a recipe card she'd found in her pocket. And Ethan was explaining something about joinery to Caleb across the table with the focused authority of someone who had decided he knew what he was talking about and was mostly right. The evening light stretched long across the table and across the yard outside and across the south acreage that was still and permanently Caleb Mercer's, and across the plains beyond where the railroad would eventually come and change the shape of things in ways none of them could fully predict yet, and none of that could be entirely controlled. And all of it was still uncertain in the ways that life remains uncertain, regardless of what documents you file or what promises you make on a morning when the frost is still on the ground. That is the truth that this particular story holds, and it is not a comfortable truth, and it is not the truth that stories usually want to tell because it is harder to sit with than the other kind. The other kind says, this is how it ends, the problem is solved, the people are safe, the future is secured. And those things were true here, as much as they are ever true, which is to say, genuinely and not completely. What is completely true is this. A woman arrived at a frontier station in November, counting 4 children and calling it a liability. A man was waiting at that station who had built a table with empty chairs and called it readiness, though it had felt for a long time more like punishment. They did not recognize each other immediately. They were too defended for that, both of them, and too correctly suspicious of a world that had offered them beautiful shapes before that turned out to be hollow. They came together in the way that people who have been broken in specific places tend to come together, slowly, practically, without much grace, with a great deal of checking the load before they put their full weight on it. And the load held. That is the thing that does not get said enough about people who have been through the kind of losses Evelyn and Caleb had each been through, the capacity for the load to hold. People who have lost things know the precise weight of what they're carrying in a way that people who haven't don't, and they test the floor more carefully, and they are right too. And when the floor holds, it means something different to them than it means to someone who never had cause to doubt it. The floor held. And Nathan, who had run down a frozen road in December, calculating himself out of a family that needed him in it, stood in the yard in the July heat with his hand on a fence post that he had repaired himself, and looked at the south acreage and said to no one in particular, "We should put the east section into hay next season. The soil's right for it, and we'd come out ahead on the feed costs." And Caleb, passing behind him with a length of wood over his shoulder, stopped and looked at the east section and said, "I was thinking the same thing." And Nathan said, "September is probably the window." And Caleb said, "September," and kept walking. And Nathan stayed at the fence post looking at the field with the expression of a boy who has found the floor solid and is standing on it with both feet. And the afternoon was very bright, and the plains ran out long and open in every direction, and somewhere behind them in the house there was the sound of Rose explaining something to Ticket in great detail, and the sound of Molly's pencil, and the sound of Ethan in the shed with something that was becoming something else, and the sound of Evelyn at the kitchen window doing the things she had done since November, looking at what was in front of her and making a true account of it. What was in front of her was a home. What she had brought to it all along was a family. And the only arithmetic that had ever been wrong was the arithmetic of people who looked at that and called it too much. It was not too much. It was exactly enough. It was, in the way of things that are genuinely enough, more than enough. It was everything.